you for having me, Reverend Song, and the One Institute. I'm really honored to be here tonight, and thank you everyone for attending. I don't take your time for granted, so I hope we can have a meaningful conversation today. In regards to the question of what got me started in thinking about Asian American Buddhists and erasure in American Buddhism, I would have to say that it was a lot of internal turmoil growing up as somebody who's a heritage Buddhist, as somebody who was raised Buddhist. My background is not in Buddhist studies. And I was somebody who grew up with an upbringing of Buddhism, but not necessarily someone who was surrounded by the study of the sutras or anything like that. So I had a familial and familiar understanding with Buddhism, particularly after my parents passed away. I kind of was really thrown into it. And at the same time, growing up in the United States, I think as heritage Buddhists, we inherit this sense just from our surroundings of needing to be quiet about being Buddhist in this Christian dominant world, or society, I should say, and trying to understand where that came from. And then gradually, as I became more involved in Buddhist spaces and more in conversation with other people who were identifying as Asian American Buddhists, which is another thing in itself, those who choose not to or do identify publicly as Asian American Buddhists, I started to hear more about these histories, and I was just really shocked that I had no way of accessing this history prior. And so I was both relieved to find out that there were these histories and there's these people who were involved in creating Asian American Buddhists and American Buddhist communities. And at the same time I was relieved, I was puzzled as to how this could be that I didn't know about this. And I think during different periods of my life, I would say that I was actively searching for this kind of information and actively searching for this kind of historical community. So that's kind of what was sort of the motivation to look into this more. So today, as I talked about, I'll be focusing this talk on the idea of historical recovery. So thinking about what was lost, why we should recover it, and simple ideas or habits for how we might approach doing this recovery. Because this is a short talk, I'll necessarily be brief. So please excuse the cursory overview of what are quite complex and nuanced topics, each in their own right. And before I begin, I know you see on the screen that I have my name as Funie Hsu /Chi, and I go by Funie Chi also. That's just the Hokkien pronunciation of my name. So I wanted to make that clear. Okay, let's continue. I'd like to start with some of the origin myths regarding Buddhism and some of the common perceptions of how Buddhism got its start in the United States. So here are some popular ideas. You've probably heard many of these. That white teachers brought it back to the United States, brought it being Buddhism back to the United States after military service or travels in Asia. That the beat poets are responsible for the popular growth of Buddhism in America, with the likes of Jack Kerouac and his 1958 Dharma Bums being an iconic association, perhaps the iconic association with Buddhism for many Americans. Or maybe you've heard that foreign Asian teachers brought Buddhism to the United States. And here we can think about D.T. Suzuki as one of the most notable figures in this category. His visits to the United States, particularly after the end of World War II in the late 40s and onward, his extended stay when he was visiting professor at Columbia was kind of at the same time that there was a heightened interest in Buddhism. And he was giving lectures as an assistant, a visiting professor at Columbia, and oftentimes they were standing room only. So these are kind of the examples of those teachers who were deemed Asian teachers that came and brought Buddhism with them to the United States. And some of the commonalities that we hear in these three general categories of origin myths are the fact that they're generally situated in a post-war temporal space, leading many to believe and to envision Buddhism as having relatively recently arrived in the United States. And again, this is a myth. These are all myths. So that would be a false impression. But that's one of the implications that these types of myths create. Additionally, they have a shared commonality of this positioning of Buddhism as being something from the outside of the United States. The notion that teachers, whether white or Asian, recently brought Buddhism from Asia readily imagines the religion to be quote unquote foreign. And oftentimes this foreignness has carried with it a connotation of being un-American. But these stories, as I mentioned, are in fact myths. So let's turn to some of the historical foundations of American Buddhism. Buddhism first gained the interest of Americans and stimulated intellectual curiosities in America in the early mid-19th century. We can think of transcendentalists like Emerson and Thoreau and how their work evoked references to Asian religions and Asian religious traditions to get a sense of how that particular literary landscape was drawn to spiritual traditions like Buddhism. In 1844, for example, the transcendentalist magazine Dial published an English translation of Eugene Burnouf's French translation of the Lotus Sutra, which sparked an early interest in the religion. However, the first communities of practicing Buddhists, which are distinct from those who turn to Buddhism for intellectual curiosity, the practicing Buddhists who embody the teachings through their ceremonies, their rituals, and their ways of being and interacting with the world and with each other, these were Asian immigrant laborers. And they were the first ones who arrived in this country and brought Buddhism as embodied practices with them. They arrived and were represented in notable populations in the mid-19th century, owing to, at first, the gold rush and then shifting demands for low-wage workers. The first major wave to arrive were the Chinese immigrant laborers, mostly from southern China, and many of them were being impacted by economic and social turmoil in China. Due to the impetus of gold, many of the immigrants resided in the West Coast, specifically in the Northern California, Oregon region, one of the prime destinations that comprised the global gold rush at the time, as the scholar Ming Ai has recently detailed. These immigrants brought with them their religious practices, often understood in this category of Chinese popular religion. And this included a dynamic combination of Taoism, Buddhism, and I put Confucianism in quotes because I guess like Taoism and Buddhism, it's also understood as a philosophy, but perhaps more so than Taoism and Buddhism. So the idea of Confucianism as a religion is something that there's still a lot of discussion around in terms of one of the quote unquote major world religions. And then Chinese popular religion also included folk religion, Chinese folk religion that were distinct to the different regions of China that the immigrants were coming from. And sometimes these traditions were practiced as this combined Chinese popular religion, but also sometimes they were practiced in their more independent forms, as we might more commonly understand them today, as like distinct forms of Taoism, of Buddhism as a separate entity, and as folk religion as separate entities. But that was not as common as this more widely understood and sophisticated form of this hybridization of the different traditions together in this idea of Chinese popular religion. Within this category of this mix represented through Chinese popular religion, we see the presence of Buddhism through the figure of Guanyin. And I'm going to talk more again later on about Guanyin, but I wanted to note that right now. Many of the early Chinese temples in these immigrant labor communities had displays of deities on their altars that demonstrated this mix. So they had Taoist figures, Buddhist figures, and the Buddhist figure would be represented by Guanyin, and folk figures, and mostly the folk, well, there were several of them, but one of the more predominant female ones was a figure by the name of Mazu. And amid this pantheon, Guanyin, which is the feminized form of Avalokiteshvara, that was popularized in China and then spread to different parts of East Asia and in some parts of Southeast Asia, like Vietnam, Guanyin was one of the most prominent and common figures of worship. In these representations, we can see the influence of Buddhism in these early Chinese religious practices, that she represented compassion and mercy as the Bodhisattva who answers the cries of all beings, speaks to an aspect of their religious life that I find quite interesting to think about in regards to trying to understand how the Chinese laborers might have developed a sense of resilience in the face of the kinds of direct violence that they faced on a daily basis. And I'll talk a little bit more and give you an example of the direct violence that they encountered. And Guanyin's presence was quite common in the temples, and many scholars point to the fact that many of the temples, indeed, even if they were classified as Taoist temples, had a Guanyin figure. Following the Chinese and federal legislation that would eventually curtail their ongoing immigration, Japanese laborers immigrated to the United States and the annexed Hawaiian territories in the late 19th century. Many of them worked in American sugar plantations in Hawaii and also in agricultural farms in the continental United States, again, primarily in the West Coast. These immigrants too brought their religious traditions, and primarily they were Buddhist and Shinto practices. A majority of these Japanese laborers were Buddhists of the Jodo Shinshu tradition, which is long focused on the needs of working class lay people. In writing of the growth of Japanese American Buddhism, the scholar Michael Matsutsugu notes, their vision of American Buddhism developed in the context of a long history of racial and religious discrimination. And it's this aspect of racial and religious discrimination as a combined element that I'd like to turn our attention to in order to better understand what was lost that we're trying to recover now. As I alluded to, the idea of recovery presupposes that something was lost. And here I'd like to propose the idea of lost, LOSS-ED, versus lost, for thinking about how it is that we are now in a position of seeking historical recovery as Buddhists, American Buddhists more broadly, and Asian American Buddhists more specifically. Lost is often, LOST, as we traditionally know the word, is often understood to be passive, something that's accidental, something that's a result of chance. In thinking about LOSS-ED instead of lost, LOST, I'm hoping to highlight that the fact that there is an activeness to this historical process that we're examining, that it wasn't simply anomalous, it wasn't isolated, it wasn't random. It was something that was done through a system and a structure, and it's something that continues to today. So it's an active structure of an exclusion. And in thinking about lost, I'd also like to propose, and I'll go into this in more detail at the end, that we might think of recovery as a kind of germination. But I just want to plant that seed now so that we can revisit it later on. Returning to lost with an ED, I believe it helps us better see the intertwined dynamics of religion and race in the story of American Buddhism's development. Indeed, central to the history of Buddhism as a religion in America is a story about race. The erasure of the historical facts of Asian immigrants and their contributions to American Buddhism is a product of a racial religious system. This is how these popular yet factually incorrect origin myths about American Buddhism's development can persist and proliferate in this day and age when knowledge is only Google search away. By focusing on the ways racial religious exclusion operated, we can look beyond the individuals who might be espousing these origin myths and see more clearly the system that has structured this condition of possibility for erasure. Similarly, the focus on racial religious exclusion allows the conditions of possibility for historical recovery. And here I'd like to share an anecdote to make these ideas a little bit more concrete. The following passage is a personal account from Dr. Xiaolan Hu, a Taiwanese American religious studies professor at the University of Detroit Mercy, who I believe uses Z here pronouns. This passage is from Here Review of Tenzin Han's Be the Refuge for the Journal of Global Buddhism. In it, Z recites an encounter with just such an origin myth. Who writes, okay, let me give a little bit more context. Who's writing about an encounter with a colleague who, in finding out that Z was going to be teaching about Buddhism in America, offered to give a guest lecture, and who describes, he thought I wouldn't know anything about American Buddhism because I am not American, as in his mind, Asian Americans are not real Americans. He eventually decided to make his guest lecture about the Beat generation, a generation he is obsessed with, and basically said to my class that there would not be Buddhism in America without the Beat generation. After he left, my students immediately commented that was obviously false. Buddhism came to America with the Chinese and Japanese immigrant workers in the 19th century. Statements of erasure like the one above by Hu's colleague stem from historical structures of racial religious exclusion. I'd like to provide some examples from the 19th century on the high stakes ways that the coupling of race and religion function to exclude Chinese immigrants from the American polity. So I'm going to share 3 quotes, and these 3 quotes are all drawn from the congressional debates on the Reconstruction Amendments following the Civil War. They focus on the 14th and 15th Amendments, which granted citizenship and the right to vote to non-white males, I should say, and led to heated debates, especially from West Coast Congress members, on prohibiting Chinese from both citizenship and suffrage, based on not just their race, but also their religion. Commenting on the 14th Amendment and the possibility of citizenship for Chinese, Representative William Higbee of California argued, quote, "The Chinese are nothing but a pagan race. You cannot make good citizens of them." So here we see the coupling of Chinese racially with pagan religiously. They're not Christian, and also they're not civilized. Discussing the 15th Amendment, the one that would confer suffrage or the right to vote, Senator Frederick Frelinghuysen of New Jersey asserted, "I believe that we should not introduce into this country hordes of pagans and heathens. I think we're under every obligation to give our own people equal unrestricted rights. I do not feel that obligation toward the people of Asia." Echoing the sentiment, Senator Henry W. Corbett of Oregon argued, "Allow Chinese suffrage, and you may soon find established pagan institutions in our midst, which may eventually supersede those Christian influences which have so long been the pride of our country." And what's important here, in addition to the combination of the ways that race and religion were used as arguments to exclude the Chinese immigrants from citizenship and voting rights, is the way that they pointed to trying to uphold this image of the United States as a Christian nation, that there's this deep assumption that the United States is in fact a Christian nation and that it should remain one. And this is an idea that we've come to see really come into the limelight once more in our current time period. As Jonathan H.X. Lee notes, such racial and religious exclusion had an impact on the development of Chinese Buddhism in the United States. He writes, "In the 19th and 20th century China, it would have been unthinkable for a community not to have a Buddhist temple. However, for many years, the various exclusionary acts barred Buddhist monks from coming to America to establish temples and serve the immigrant Chinese population. And I forgot to mention that as a result of the rampant anti-Chinese sentiment that we saw being expressed in the quotes above, and that was being espoused in the general society during the time period, decades following the congressional debates around the Reconstruction Amendments, in 1882, the federal government passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which banned Chinese laborers from the United States, impacting the growth of Chinese religious practice. And the Chinese Exclusion Act wouldn't be repealed until 1943. So Jonathan Lee is noting how these exclusionary acts, there were several of them preceding the Chinese Exclusion Act, had this direct impact on the formulation and the continued growth of Buddhist practice in the United States, at least as it applied to the early Chinese immigrants. In looking at these historical forms of racial and religious exclusion and erasure, we can begin to glean the importance of historical recovery. So I think the fact that we now need to unearth these histories starts to become more apparent, given that there's a little more understanding of the system and how it created the condition for erasure. It created the conditions for people to assume that Buddhism was something that really came to the United States in the post-war period. I'd like to borrow, in thinking about historical recovery, from the scholar Catherine Jin Lum and her recovery of the trope, quote unquote, heathen, in her book, Heathen, Religion and Race in American History. By bringing together historical case studies and showing how they build on and resonate with one another over time, Lum argues, we can see the overlooked power of the heathen underpinning a white American Christian superiority complex, as well as participation in and opposition to the same by people historically considered to be part of the so-called heathen world. So recovery not only highlights this intertwined dynamic of racial and religious exclusion and oppression, but also how people labeled heathen, including Asian immigrant Buddhists, were resilient in the face of it. In this historical recovery work, we must first recognize the very real effects of racial religious exclusion. So here I'm getting to kind of the daily direct forms of anti-Asian / Buddhist violence that these early immigrants encountered. Fortunately, today there's a growing movement to do this kind of acknowledgement of these histories as a form of historical recovery. And we can see that through this growing movement to acknowledge the violent burnings and destructions of many of the early Chinese communities during the mid to late 19th century. And I like to focus just on one example, one that's near to me as a faculty member at San Jose State University. And that's the series of destructions. So it wasn't just one, it was a series of burnings of the many Chinatowns that were built and rebuilt in San Jose. And in this image, we see, I think it was the third burning of a Chinatown that was known as the Second Market Street Chinatown. And the caption illuminates that this happened in 1887. So there were at least 5 Chinatowns in San Jose in the mid to late 1900s. The first one was known as the First Market Street Chinatown. And that one was pretty quickly burned down following its construction. But one of the things that is important, as I mentioned a few times already, in the process of this kind of historical recovery, we not only learn about, as I mentioned, the racial and religious exclusion, how race and religion intertwine in efforts to exclude and oppress, and often very violent ways, but we also learn about how people persisted and they maintained their practices. They maintained their religious practices that incorporated Buddhism or that were based primarily in Buddhism. And we'll see different examples of that. But the fact that they continued to rebuild the Chinatowns, that there were 5 different Chinatowns, that speaks a lot to the resilience. And some of I mentioned that there's a movement to acknowledge the destruction of these Chinatowns, and I just wanted to share some of the cities that in the recent years since COVID, in part because of the resurgence of anti-Asian violence during the COVID period, these cities have issued official apologies. And the first one was Antioch in California. All of these examples are in California. In May of 2021, San Jose in September of 2021, San Francisco in 2022, Los Angeles, and then most recently in Santa Ana, California, which is in Southern California. And that one's also near to me too, because I grew up in Orange County, just a city away from Santa Ana. Okay, so now I'd like to return a little bit to our earlier conversation about Guanyin and how Guanyin provides a very tangible, explicit way to see the Buddhist connections in these early Chinese religious practices. Part of what was destroyed in these destructions of the Chinatown and the burnings were the religious sites of worship. Little evidence remains of most of the original Chinese temples that existed. The Yingsheng Temple is an example of a temple that was rebuilt after the 1877 fire in San Jose. And this building was later, even after it was rebuilt, it was demolished to make way for city development. But following that demolishment, it was reconstructed. And so that's the image that we're looking at on the left-hand side, the reconstruction of this Yingxing Temple, which means Temple of Five Gods. And the Temple of Five Gods is a reference to the fact that it is a place where the Chinese popular religion was practiced, where that sophisticated combination of Taoism, Buddhism, and Confucianism and folk religion was practiced. If you look to the image on the right, that altar, it's the original gilded altar of the temple. I believe the temple was created in 1888. So that's the original altar. You can't see the statues of the gods very well because it's quite small in this picture, and unfortunately this was the best picture that I could find. But right behind the incense burner is what I believe the figure of the Guanyin. I was actually able to zoom in on another, they have a virtual tour space that if you wanted to, you can go there and visit and kind of zoom in. And so the Guanyin is right behind there, I believe. And then I think to the right of that is that feminine, the other feminine deity, which is Mazu. And sometimes Guanyin and Mazu, they would be represented with the same figure as almost kind of interchangeable because they were both these nurturing, protecting female figures. But this example really, I think, makes concrete and visually tangible the ways that Buddhist practice was incorporated in these early Chinese religious traditions. And as I mentioned, for me, I'm quite fascinated by what it might mean that Guanyin was the bodhisattva of compassion, and how that might have perhaps inspired or stirred motivation to keep going, to keep rebuilding in the face of this violent destruction, to keep having faith in their religious practices. Okay, with Chinese exclusion, there was an increase in Japanese immigration due to American labor needs in the continent and in the American-owned sugar plantations in Hawaii. These immigrants, initially mostly men, as I mentioned earlier, brought their religious traditions with them. The Byukyo Sennenkai, or the Young Men's Buddhist Association, was formed in San Francisco in 1898 by a group of Japanese immigrants. They were supported by the Honpa Hongwanji in Japan, the headquarters of the Jodo Shinshu religious institution in Japan, who sent missionaries to San Francisco. And this formed the basis for what is now known as the Buddhist Church of San Francisco that was established that same year. And the Buddhist Church of San Francisco is the first Jodo Shinshu Buddhist temple in the continental United States. It's still standing. It's still at the current location on Pine and Octavia in San Francisco that it was at when it was later moved in 1910. And on the image on the right, we see an image of the altar inside the Buddhist Church of San Francisco, which it's quite large, you can tell. And I think it helps to give a sense of how central ceremony and ritual was in the religious Buddhist practices of the Japanese immigrants, which might be quite contrary to some other forms of Buddhism that focus on meditation, especially the more popularized forms that people are drawn to, especially converts who are drawn to today. Because racial and religious exclusion was not accidental, as I mentioned, it wasn't random, but was in fact part of a system. The Japanese Americans also faced marginalization and anti-Asian / anti-Buddhist violence. Reverend Dr. Duncan Ryukin Williams, in his recent work, American Sutra, has detailed the manner in which the World War II incarceration of people of Japanese ancestry in America, including those people who were Japanese American, so they were born in Japan and therefore had full citizenship rights, had full constitutional rights. They were incarcerated, and how this was not simply a matter of race and racial oppression, but also that religion factored into their exclusion and their perception as being quote unquote perpetual foreigners, despite, again, the fact that many of them were actually American citizens. And Williams notes how the first people to be arrested for questioning by the FBI immediately following the bombing of Pearl Harbor were Japanese Buddhist priests. And in fact, Buddhist leaders, he describes, were classified as more of a national threat than their Japanese Christian counterparts. In this work, Duncan also demonstrates how, in spite of the injustices of incarceration, Japanese American Buddhists persisted in their faith and helped to further the development of Buddhism in America, not just for themselves, but for other people. And they were foundational for people such as the beat poets, and granting kind of pathways for access to Buddhism to the people such as the beat poets, who would later on be sort of central figures in these origin myths that proliferate today. In the image on the right, we see an example of this kind of persistence of faith within the incarceration camps. And it's labeled quite clearly with the signage on the table that the group we're seeing here is engaged in Buddhist work while they're incarcerated in a War Relocation Authority managed camp. And this is a Buddhist study group in Fresno in 1942. More recently, in the COVID era, we've seen this resurgence of overt physical anti-Asian violence. And again, it's not just a racial violence, it's not simply anti-Asian, it's also come out in anti-Asian and anti-religious, Asian religious ways, anti-Asian and anti-Buddhist ways, to be more specific to our particular concerns today. Here is two images from the same temple, the Hoang Tik Temple, which is a Vietnamese American temple in Santa Ana, California, of vandalism, an act of vandalism that occurred in November 2020, so the year that COVID hit. 15 of the temple's Buddha and Bodhisattva statues were vandalized and spray painted. And as you can see, one of them was spray painted. You probably can't see the whole word, but you might be able to guess. This one was spray painted with the word Jesus. And in 2020 alone, there were 17 reports of hate incidents, violent incidents at Asian American Buddhist sites. And because those were only the incidents that reported, the actual numbers may actually be higher. The resurgence of the anti-Asian and anti-religious animosity points to the urgency of historical recovery work as a way of sense-making, but also a way of resilience building. And now I want to revisit that idea that I planted earlier of germination pedagogy, of thinking about recovery as a kind of germination and a kind of way of acting upon it as an education. So let's think about germination first to square away our understanding about that. And I'm using the common understanding of germination and then taking it into different directions. but I'm starting from the base of understanding germination as a way that we can cause something to sprout or develop, cause something to begin to grow, or to come into being, to evolve. And in this regards, I'd like to offer that we conceive of the process of historical recovery and the intention of historical recovery in relationship to the idea of planting seeds, which is a really common and often used phrase in different Buddhist traditions. Sometimes you might hear planting the seeds of the Dharma, planting the seeds of Buddhism, planting karmic seeds. And I'd like to think about, well, what if we consider those early Asian immigrant Buddhists as people who were also planting seeds of Buddhism. I think this is really important as a way to move away from the stereotypes and the tropes of these Asian immigrant laborers as being pagan and heathen or a menace, as they were often referred to, and to see them as being active contributors to society, to see them as people that were planting the historical seeds of Buddhism in America, and people who were contributing not just to American Buddhism, but people who were contributing to American society in general. So the focus here is on the active nature of their contribution instead of some of the historical messaging that we've heard time and time again, that they're pagan, that they're heathen, that they're a drain to society, or that they're a threat to society, and that they're un-American. Planting seeds enables us to envision them as growing America instead of taking away from it. And so I think about that in the historic sense of planting seeds, as I just discussed, but also in the way that they then enabled communities to grow, communities of different American Buddhists, not just Asian American Buddhists, but different American Buddhist traditions, for them to flower. And as planting seeds in a community sense, in regards to how we can do this historical work together as a collective, and how that can be our own planting of seeds. And then finally, to think about planting seeds as a kind of understanding and reflection of ourselves. And in doing this kind of historical work, perhaps we can plant our own seeds for our own spiritual development and our own development as American Buddhist practitioners who want to contribute something else to our American Buddhist Sangha. And finally, this idea of germination pedagogy recovery as a kind of growth enables us to think about the destruction, the violence that was caused, not just as something that was lost, not just something that was done to these people, but to envision that their contributions weren't all destroyed, but merely laid dormant, like seeds might lay dormant. Germination usually happens when a seed lays dormant for a period of time, and then it starts to grow. So germination enables us to think about this recovery in a sense of possibility, that what we lost in the burning of these Chinatowns, in incarceration, etc., perhaps was not really lost. Perhaps they were just seeds waiting for the right causes and conditions. And in participating and being actively engaged in germination pedagogy as a kind of historical recovery, perhaps we can start cultivating the seeds and creating the conditions for them to grow. And then for me, I think about also the common Buddhist phrase and metaphor of lotus growing in the mud, that the lotus needs the mud, and those kinds of particular conditions in order to grow. So being able to work with and compost the violence and the destruction and make it into something that's generative. And then finally, I wanted to leave us with a few suggestions or habits of practice for putting this germination pedagogy of historical recovery into our own daily practice. And I'd like to think about them as simple things that we can do. So there's the practice of invitation, meaning And you can think about this in the context of an invitation to question myths. If you're in a place and you hear other people sharing these and expressing these myths that we talked about in one of the earlier slides, perhaps the first slide, about, Buddhism was brought to the United States by white teachers, or Buddhism was made popular by the beat poets, you can invite yourself to question these myths. And you can also invite others to participate with you and germinate together with you in questioning as well. And you can share these historical facts, this historical recovery. It's a practice of examination, looking at the social historical environment, meaning looking at the racial and religious forms of exclusion and how they continue to today. It's also a practice of looking at ourselves, looking inward and thinking about where we might be positioned in this social historical environment, and considering, well, what might our own obligations and duties be based on how we're positioned in this landscape, what our obligations related to our privileges or our lack thereof might be, and how we're then interdependently related to each other, and how together we can come together to create the conditions and the right soil, the right environment for the growth of these historical seeds, and perhaps even the planting of new ones. And then finally, it's a practice of curiosity and thinking about how we can approach historical work not as something in which we need to search for answers and definitive truths about how these early Asian American or early Asian immigrant Buddhist communities practice Buddhism and the specific details, and to know everything about it, but to think about it as a process of becoming. Because in fact, for example, if you're trying to do the actual historical work of recovery, and for the case of the Chinese communities that were burned down, some of this historical recovery is going to be incomplete because there isn't the kind of traditional types of evidence that we rely on, the textual evidence or the artifacts that we can point to or hold and examine and say, yes, we know this to be true because we see this kind of evidence. So some of this recovery work is impossible in that sense. Therefore, I think that if we focus on the curiosity, it enables us to prioritize how germination and recovery is a process of becoming, and not necessarily finding answers, but it's the search for the answers that will help us be our own seeds in our own self-growth.